Good afternoon. Thank you very much for being here. The purpose of this lecture recital is to serve as a comprehensive resource for performing Adam Gorb's Concerto for Clarinet. It is a great work that, due to large orchestration, high rental fees, and relative obscurity, has only been performed once, its premiere in 1999. With Adam Gorb's permission, I've spent the past year and a half arranging his concerto for small chamber ensemble, and we will be performing this arrangement on the second half. I will explore the major compositional influences of this piece, cite personally conducted interviews with both Gorb and Nicholas Cox, who's the clarinetist that premiered the work, and offer insight into successful preparations of the work, specifically addressing the klezmer techniques used, as well as other issues clarinet related. My hope is that the information offered in this lecture recital, in conjunction with the availability of the arrangement, will make the piece more accessible for performers, ultimately leading to more performances of this concerto. For those of us that don't know much about Adam Gorb, he was born in 1958. He's a Welsh composer who is currently the head of the School of Composition at the Royal Northern College of Music in Manchester. In his early days, he played both the clarinet and piano and began composing at the age of 10. Benjamin Britten, a composer who's been a lifelong interest to Gorb, reviewed some of his early scores and made a special point of advising and encouraging the young composer. He went on to study composition at Cambridge University with Hugh Wood and Robin Holloway. After graduating, he continued to compose and also worked as a musician in the theater in London. He went on to earn his master's degree at the Royal Academy of Music, completing supplemental studies on the side with Paul Patterson. His years in the theater brought him in contact with guitar, electric bass, accordion, and drum set, all of which aren't traditionally found in a modern orchestra, but are used in some of his compositions. His trombone concerto, Downtown Derivations, for example, uses drum set, which perfectly captures the jazz and Latin voice of the piece. Gorb cites Stephen Sondheim as one of his musical idols and uses some of the elements of Sondheim's compositional style, as well as other British and American pop music in his own compositions. This is very much in keeping with Gorb's philosophy of music, saying, and I quote, "New art should be more accessible than anything else because it's about how we live now," end quote. Gorb writes his music that he himself would want to hear. He does a fantastic job of encompassing light, accessible melodies, as well as a variety of rhythmic nuances and a more modern harmonic vocabulary. He is able to write tuneful melodies accompanying jazz, pop, and Jewish folk music, while also carefully crafting a solid structure, phrasing, and rich harmonic support. Although Gorb has composed in many genres, he's most known in the United States for his works for wind ensemble. His first work to receive international acclaim was Metropolis in 1992, followed by Away Day 4 years later, both of these for wind ensemble. The Concerto for Clarinet is written for a modern-sized orchestra, so 2 flutes, piccolo, 3 oboes and an English horn, E-flat and bass clarinet, 2 bassoons, contrabassoon, 4 horns, 3 trumpets, 2 trombones and a bass trombone, tuba, 4 percussionists, and harp and strings. The concerto is just under 30 minutes and consists of 3 movements, andante agitato, allegro vivace, and epilogue, all played without pause. It was commissioned by the Liverpool Harmonic Society for the Royal Liverpool Harmonic Orchestra and written for British clarinetist Nicholas Cox. The premiere took place on October 20th in 1999 with Nicholas Cox as the soloist, conducted by Vernon Handley. This is the only documented performance of the work. Music for the concerto is only available through a rental agreement with Edition Peters, though my performance will consist of a version for chamber ensemble arranged by myself. The arrangement is for, as you can see on stage, clarinet, bassoon, trumpet, trombone, violin, bass, lots and lots of percussion, as well as piano. I do have permission from Adam Gorb as well as Edition Peters to pursue this arrangement. The Concerto for Clarinet does not rely on the characteristics of pop or theater music as do some of Gorb's other compositions, but rather it takes inspiration from klezmer music, something that is common in many of his works featuring the clarinet. Klezmer music can be described as Eastern European Jewish folk music, and I'll explain this in further detail later in the lecture. Gorb tends to feature the clarinet prominently in many of his works for large ensemble, most notably in his work for wind ensemble, Farewell, and also Yiddish Dances. For any other clarinetists in the audience, he has also written several other solo works for clarinet as well as chamber works for clarinet as well. In the next couple of years, look out for a CD that I may or may not be working on, doing all the chamber works of Adam Gorb. So, check iTunes. Overall, there's relatively little literature about Adam Gorb, which is partly due to the fact that his music only began gaining popularity in the mid-1990s. The majority of the material available about Gorb and his compositions have been centered around his wind ensemble literature, for which he is best known. The lack of information regarding his clarinet works is why I feel that this lecture recital is so important. This music needs to be promoted, and there needs to be more sources for musicians to get information about Adam Gorb's clarinet works. There are several composers that Adam Gorb emulates in his works: Shostakovich, Stravinsky, Mozart, and Bach, just to name a few. A good example of this practice is Gorb's French Dances Revisited, which is written for double wind quintet. It's a neo-Baroque work based on the form and style of J.S. Bach's music, in which he creates a variation on Bach's Prelude in C, number 939. In another chamber work that he wrote, A Better Place, Gorb emulates Mozart in several instances. Number one, he chose the instrumentation of oboe, clarinet, horn, bassoon, and piano, the same as Mozart's Quintet for Piano and Winds, K452. The piece begins with an Alberti bass line in the piano and a very simple melody heard in the oboe. And that Alberti bass, which is heard in many works by Mozart, that Alberti bass line comes back several times throughout the work, reminding the audience of the constant Mozart influence. Towards the end of the work, Gorb quotes two of his favorite pieces, Mozart's Clarinet Quintet, K581, and Stravinsky's Octet for Wind Instruments. In Burlesque, a work that is for clarinet choir, and there's also arrangement out there for saxophone choir, Gorb does not directly quote Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, but there are several similarities that reference the sacrificial dance throughout the entire burlesque piece. Sharp ostinato figures, as well as a syncopated rhythmic gesture, show themselves throughout the piece, and it's very clear that Stravinsky was in his mind during the conception of the piece. In the Concerto for Clarinet, Gorb uses symphonic works of Gustav Mahler as a source for inspiration. Quote, "There are two important musical areas that have guided me during the writing of the clarinet concerto. One is the field of Yiddish folk music, or klezmer. The other is the music of Gustav Mahler, a composer who, in my mind, foresaw the horrors of the 20th century in his work like no other composers." End quote. The Mahlerian influence can be seen in several key ways: instrumentation, direct and approximate musical quotes, and the use of an offstage or side stage ensemble. Mahler's symphonies are well known for their unusually large and extended instrumentation. He regularly calls upon instruments like the piccolo or English horn, and others that are often regulated to secondary or tertiary roles in the orchestra. Gorb also chose to employ some of these instruments in the full version of the concerto, using piccolo, E-flat clarinet, English horn, contrabassoon, and various percussion instruments, such as a pantomime whistle, ruta, a hammer, and a lion's roar. Throughout the Concerto for Clarinet, Gorb quotes motives from all but one of Mahler's 10 symphonies. If you all see your packet that you got when you walked in, you'll notice that there's a list of comprehensive summary of the quotes with examples both from Mahler's symphonies as well as the corresponding examples from Adam Gorb's Clarinet Concerto. We'll show some of those examples right now. The first example is seen in Mahler's Symphony No. 10 in the first movement. We see that the chord that he uses at the climax of rehearsal 28 is the same chord used at the climax of the first movement of the Clarinet Concerto. Very loud, very crunchy. Every note in the chromatic scale in that one. The next example is from Mahler's Symphony No. 9, the third movement, that we're going to also play. The ones to be listening for is the line between the bassoon and trombone and the violin. 2, ready? The next example comes from Mahler's Fourth Symphony in the second movement. And this aspect is actually written in the clarinet line, and I will be able to, and he gives it to the clarinet solo in the concerto. In Mahler's Symphony No. 7, in the second movement, the bassoons have a trio that plays the following melody. In the concerto, I have rewritten that for trumpet and trombones. The next quote comes from Mahler's Second Symphony in the third movement, originally heard in the violins, but in this chance we get to hear it in the double bass. Next one is Mahler's First Symphony in the first movement, heard in the cello section. In this case, we get to hear it as a duet between the bassoon and the trombone. The next example is from Das Lied von der Eid. It is the third movement, heard originally in the oboe line that he gives to the clarinet. In Mahler's Symphony No. 5, in the fifth movement, the original theme here at the very beginning is heard in the bassoon, and we get to hear that in the concerto in the piano. Mahler's Symphony No. 7, first movement, the line is heard in the piccolo, and we get to hear this in the final movement, heard in the violin. In Mahler's Second Symphony, in the fifth movement, there's a very loud and fortissimo section played by all of the horns in the horn section that we get to hear that same motive, but heard at piano, heard by a lonely little trumpet. The last example that we hear is from Mahler's Symphony No. 4, the fourth movement, heard in as a duet from all of the flute players, and in this case we get to hear it in the piano. In addition to the direct symphonic quotes that we just heard, there are many approximate quotes or areas where it sounds Mahler-esque, where we can definitely hear that Mahler was in his mind during the conception of the work. Mahler is the only known composer to call for a hammer in the percussion setup, which is a large wooden hammer used to strike a large hollow wooden box. It is used in his Sixth Symphony, and Gorb chose to use it at the climax of the first movement in measure 136. Gorb also makes another peculiar and unusual instrumentation choice in the final movement of the concerto when he calls for sleigh bells. This is obviously reminiscent of Mahler's Symphony No. 4, where the entire work begins and ends with the use of sleigh bells. Gorb really tries to aim and capture the feel of Mahler's music in this concerto, saying, and I quote, "It's as if he's trying to embrace the whole world, and it's the contrast between extreme profundity and banality. The way that he uses pop music elements in his works is a way that no one has done before, and the sort of embracing the ugly as well as the beautiful in life," end quote. This beautifully echoes the sentiment that Gorb had in his concerto's program notes, saying, quote, a wonderful, some would say terrible characteristic of the Jewish people is the ability to laugh in the face of terror. It is a constant feature in Mahler's music, and I also hear it in klezmer music that is played at weddings, parties, and bar mitzvahs. This juxtaposition of high comedy and deep melancholy runs through the clarinet concerto. Another unique feature of many Mahler symphonies is the use of offstage musicians. There are offstage musicians found in Mahler's symphonies 1, 2, 3, 6, 7, and 8. Gorb makes use of similar extension of the orchestra in this concerto. He asks for a group of instruments to go to the front of the stage with the clarinet soloist to form a mini klezmer band in the middle of the concerto. The instruments that he asks to go to the front of the stage consist of E-flat clarinet, violin, trumpet, trombone, an optional accordion. Due to instances beyond my control, we will not have accordion today. I apologize. Double bass and solo clarinet. This is a very clear homage to Mahler's works, and it is very unusual to find in symphonic works, let alone the concerto repertoire. Gorb chose the music of Mahler because he wanted to write a large-scale orchestral work combining two areas of relating to his Jewish heritage. With this said, the religious influence of Gustav Mahler has been well researched and well documented. There are arguments of both pro and anti-Semitism from writers and musicologists spanning over 7 decades. I'm not going to go into very much detail regarding any of these arguments, rather just discuss the Jewish elements found in parts of his music. Mahler himself was born to a Jewish family in Bohemia, modern-day the Czech Republic, and grew up surrounded by Hasidic music. There are several instances that demonstrate these influences found in his music. The most obvious would have to be in the 3rd movement of his 1st symphony. Leonard Bernstein believed these elements to be both the melodic material consisting of the Phrygian mode as well as the portrayal of sobbing, as seen in many of dances at Yiddish weddings. Peter Gradenwitz describes this harmonic minor scale by saying, quote, "The augmented second regarded as a typical Jewish interval," end quote. It is these intervals that gives the melodic material a feeling of, to steal Bernstein's term, Yiddishness. Melodically, the 2nd movement of the 4th symphony, Oboe 2, demonstrates the sobbing idea with large leaps of 6ths and 7ths. This can be seen in your packet in example 1.1 from Mahler's 4th symphony. An example of the aforementioned augmented seconds can be seen in his 1st symphony in the 1st oboe line. The combinations of these elements are some of the ways that Mahler's Jewish identity made its way into his music. I'm going to now go into further detail regarding the way that Gorb treats the sobbing idea along with the traditional klezmer elements. In example 1.2, we see in Mahler's 1st symphony the use of augmented seconds in the oboe line. He uses this interval several times throughout the concerto in both melodic material or grace notes. In example 1.3, it demonstrates this, but the melodic material throughout the entire concerto is based on a lot of these elements. In addition to the strong ties to Mahler, the Concerto for Clarinet is heavily influenced with klezmer music. The Yiddish word klezmer is commonly used to denote Eastern European Jewish dance musicians. It is a combination of 2 Hebrew words, kle, meaning vessel, and zemer, meaning song. During the early 1990s, Gorb became interested in his Jewish heritage, and this interest provided itself to be a well of inspiration for many of his works. This also led him to discover that his second cousin is Merlin Shepard, who is a well-known klezmer clarinetist. Gorb is quite explicit when addressing the inspiration for this concerto. Quote, "Obviously, the key historical event for the Jewish people in the last century was the Holocaust. I wouldn't be able to begin to write a piece of music about such a tragic period in our history. I wasn't there, and evil on such a large scale goes beyond the realms of artistic expression. Where I feel that I can say something is about the ultimate failure of the Holocaust is the fact that the Jewish culture was not destroyed, but lives on triumphantly." End quote. Throughout the concerto, there are moments where there is a bell played 6 times, representing the 6 million Jewish people that were killed during the Holocaust. That's one. There will be 5 others. As I mentioned earlier, Gorb was particularly fond of the clarinet and used it in a lot of his large-scale works for wind ensemble, several of which showcase the klezmer style. The klezmer material used in the concerto is not borrowed or quoted, but rather all original themes. Throughout the concerto, there are some techniques that are based on the klezmer tradition, but there is not enough to say that this is a klezmer concerto, rather than a blend of traditional and klezmer clarinet playing. The first movement does not emphasize the clarinet influence. At most, Gorb makes use of downward glissandi and melodic material utilizing the augmented seconds. Starting the second movement, there's a percussion feature during which a sustained pitch bend from the soloist alerts the audience to a drastic shift in character. We leave the serene landscape of the first movement as the clarinet spins playful dance motives in 5/8 meter, continually making use of upward and downward glissandi to continue hinting at the klezmer breakdown section to come. We finally reach the klezmer pinnacle of the piece at rehearsal 57, when Gorb directs the soloists and other instruments to gather at the side of the stage for a dedicated klezmer section. All the instruments in this impromptu klezmer band take turns passing the melody, and the clarinet functions as part of an ensemble as opposed to the leading solo voice. This direction is for full orchestra version. The performance of this arrangement will have no stage movement because we would all just move and then move back, and it would be awkward for everybody involved. Thankfully for clarinetists with little or no experience with klezmer music, Gorb wrote the concerto in a way that makes the style very accessible. The main klezmer style that Gorb uses is the downward glissando, or krekets, or dredeleks, which is Hebrew for groan. Jewish performers often use this word to distinguish themselves from their non-Jewish colleagues, such as myself. Thank you very much to my good friend Donnie Wood for teaching me all these Hebrew and Yiddish words. It was very helpful for the pronunciation. Other klezmer techniques that are used are chokas, which is a laugh-like instrumental sound, and kachas. Gorb simply writes a descending glissando for this effect, as seen in your packet in example 1.4. These techniques are found in other forms of Jewish oral expression, including cantoral music and folk songs. They are often used in improvisatory settings and are specifically used to demonstrate the style in which klezmorium are playing. In the concerto, these techniques are written out and designated with a descending line that sometimes says gliss, and other times, when it's closer together and it cannot fit the word gliss is omitted and it's just a line drawn. To become more familiar with this style, I recommend to future clarinetists listening to celebrated klezmer clarinetists such as David Krakauer and Giora Feidman, to name a few. When I first started to explore this style years before coming acquainted with this concerto, I studied recordings by the above-mentioned gentlemen and tried to replicate this style. During my interview with Nicholas Cox, who, like me, does not necessarily consider himself to be a klezmer clarinetist, he also recommended listening to the great players for a better understanding of this style. He said, and I quote, "In particular, I need to establish in my mind how the idiom sounded and learn about the dredelech and this kind of dance idiom and rhythms that I would encounter, and then learn to imitate these as best as I could," end quote. Speaking to the difficult techniques at hand, there are several instances where Gorb asks the clarinet to play at the top of the instrument's range. High B's and C's are found at the climaxes of these works. This, in conjunction with the numerous glissandi, makes for a bit of a challenge. During the percussion introduction in the second movement, the clarinet plays a long C, which in the music is notated to bend the pitch a quarter tone flat and then return to C. No specific quarter tone fingerings are necessary for this, as it is intended to bend by changing the tongue position and embouchure pressure. If the performer prefers, they could place the right hand fingers down in conjunction with a change of embouchure pressure in order to get the desired pitch bend. Other features that add to the difficulty of this concerto include fast runs that do not follow standard finger patterns, as well as very difficult rhythms in both the solo line and as well as the ensemble. Cox spoke about this during our interview, saying, and I quote, "The other issue is staying in the right place in the 5/8 section after figure 32, when you're trying to negotiate the smears and note bends and still remember how many bars you have counted. I wrote in lots of cues and relied on my colleagues rather a lot," end quote. Rhythmic complexity across all parts makes it difficult to put together and stay together as an ensemble. This concerto is designed not only for an advanced clarinetist, but an advanced chamber ensemble or orchestra as well. Even with the chamber version, a conductor is needed due to the time changes and the extreme complexity of all the individual parts. When I first approached Adam Gorb over 2 years ago about arranging his concerto, the first thing he said was, "Wow, that sounds like a lot of work," because he wrote the piece, so he knew what it was. And I was like, "Oh yes, it'll be fine." And yes, it was a lot of work. As you can imagine, rewriting a piece that was originally written for over 60 players for a reduced ensemble of 8 is a bit of a daunting task. The initial spark for this project came from my desire to perform this clarinet concerto and my lack of resources to do so. Many concertos have a secondary performance option, usually a piano reduction, providing students and professionals another way to perform the work without the need of a costly orchestra. Due to the nature of this concerto, specifically the comprehensive and vital role of the percussion, a piano reduction would not have been a viable option. Upon reviewing Gorb's other compositions, I found that he himself has arranged some of his larger works for smaller instrumentations. His piece for wind ensemble, Yiddish Dances, has been arranged for a guitar quartet, as well, and it's also separately been arranged for piano 2 hands. He has a klezmer ballet, Kol Simcha, which is originally for a small klezmer ensemble for a ballet that he himself arranged for a suite for just flute, clarinet, and piano. This turned my attention towards the challenge of what instruments would be the best suited to carry out this arrangement. Should I choose to reduce the orchestra size? And luckily, the section of the concerto provided me with an answer. The second movement that houses that klezmer section, where Gorb asks those various instruments to come to the clarinet at the front of the stage to form a klezmer band. And that particular instrumentation is very similar to Stravinsky's Soldier's Tale, which is a pillar of 20th century chamber music. Soldier's Tale calls for clarinet, bassoon, trumpet, trombone, violin, double bass, and percussion. Observing the similarities in Gorb and Stravinsky's music, it felt appropriate to model this arrangement after that particular ensemble. Additionally, it was very important for me to choose an instrumentation that was not wholly alien to those musicians who may want to perform this piece. For instance, if an ensemble was to perform Soldier's Tale, which has a very unique instrumentation, this arrangement would present them with another convenient performance option in that particular ensemble. After selecting my target instrumentation, it became clear that there was a drastic need for more treble voices to be present in the arrangement. The solo clarinet part is, for the most part, unchanged from the original. The only issues that I added, or the only parts that I added in, were a couple melodic material that the E-flat clarinet had that I, in turn, added to the clarinet part. And this prompted my decision to add the piano to the instrumentation, both to fill in the melodic material as needed, as sort of a catch-all for any other voice that couldn't be covered by another instrument. This also keeps the piece accessible, as a piano is a fairly easy addition to most other chamber ensembles. The piano is tasked with being something of a chameleon, serving as chordal accompaniment, providing percussive sounds, carrying the melody, and affecting color changes. At the end of the first movement in Gorb's original, the strings are asked to execute a quiet, continuous ascending and descending glissando on their respective notes, creating a color effect that transitions into the second movement. Not having the large string sections necessary to execute this, I asked that the pianist play the written chord with a damper and sostenuto pedal, and then strum the piano's strings slowly to achieve a similar effect. There are other times where the piano has to act as a section of 4 French horns, as well as an entire section of strings. In this last example, the piano provides rhythmic support and direction and is able to help convey some of the sense of the scale of the original concerto. Gorb's original instrumentation calls for 4 percussionists, utilizing over 30 different percussion instruments over the course of the entire concerto. Dialing it back to 1 player proved to be a bit of a challenge. The role of the percussion in any given piece can be divided into 3 categories: accent and punctuation, solo material, and timekeeping. My goal was to maintain the integrity of the percussion's role between Gorb's original and the arrangement. The needs of the percussionist in the outer movements are mostly accent and punctuation. It's that 5/8 section in the middle of the second movement that provides the most percussion issues. This section is essentially a duet between the percussion and the clarinet soloist. In order to successfully arrange the second movement, I needed to utilize more than 1 percussion voice. At first, there were 2 options: give all the members of the ensemble small percussion instruments to play, or find alternative sounds that they can make on their respective instrument. After consulting with other percussionists, it became fairly clear that not all percussionists are comfortable with giving everybody else their instruments to play. So to accommodate this, I decided to explore the various percussive elements that were possible on the non-percussion instruments of the ensemble. I asked the trombone player to strike their mute with a pencil, or in this case, a wedding band. The bass player has an ostinato side drum by tapping on his bass. The bassoonist takes a metal beater and strikes a metal music stand. And the violin, I skipped one. The piano plays a cowbell. We originally tried to have prepared piano, but after losing multiple thimbles and paper clips inside the piano, we decided just to give her a cowbell. So we gave her a cowbell. some good cowbell. We asked the violin to make a scratchy sound on the bow near the bridge. With this assistance from the other ensemble members, the percussionist is then free to play everything. We have cymbals, tempo blocks, tom-toms, bass drum with a foot pedal, vibroslap, pantomime whistle, bongos, tambourine, and wood blocks, just in that one little percussion section. In an additional attempt to aid the percussionist, I have included in the packet a diagram that's been created in order to facilitate an efficient setup needed for this instrument. Battery instruments are all set up on stands at the forefront of the percussion section, allowing them to be struck with either one hand or with various types of sticks. And then on the sides of the instrument, we have the mallet instruments on either side. In Gorb's original, there are two transitional sections in which the strings are asked to enter on and sustain a pitch. Entrances are layered and staggered, and they're held. With only one string player in this arrangement, the vibraphone I thought was going to be a perfect choice to provide the pitches and the sustained tones needed for this effect. Another instrument that's found only in Mahler's works is the hammer, used in his Sixth Symphony. The hammer is very effective with a large orchestra, but would sound horrifying with only 8 people on stage. So the combination of a bass drum and a tam-tam played very loudly is going to substitute for that, and I think we'll be okay. Throughout the arrangement, it was very important for me to provide the effect of the percussion and to make sure that its role was being had. So we wanted to make sure that it was physically feasible for the percussionist to be able to play these various instruments, and maybe not necessarily for the exact instrument that Gorb intended for his original performance, but that the effect was in place. Throughout the arrangement, the brass players are asked to fill in many missing instruments and rely heavily on various mutes to achieve the correct color. For example, the trumpet is asked to play a melodic line that originally was written for English horn and achieves the appropriate timbre using a Harmon mute with the stem in. It is then asked to sound like a stopped horn, and the brass together use a straight mute. During the second movement, the trumpet and trombone player are both instructed to play with Harmon mutes, and using their hand, they create a bit of a wah-wah effect, using their hands to go in and out. Due to the lack of treble voices, the bassoon line is called upon to play at the extreme ranges for the instrument. I constantly ask it to play the lowest B flat up to the highest E flat. Despite the registral challenges, the bassoon part is fairly idiomatic for the instrument, but also extremely challenging. Despite the assistance from the bassoon, the violin player is saddled with the bulk of the treble lines, and you can ask her, making it probably one of the most virtuosic parts of this concerto. It could easily be called Adam Gorb's Violin Concerto, now with more clarinet. It's a very difficult line. In this arrangement, in the actual piece, there are several little instances where a melodic line will be passed between the E-flat clarinet and the flute and the piccolo. And instead of everybody getting a little taste, she does the whole kit and caboodle. So it makes for a fairly challenging part, and I thank her very much for learning this. Of all the parts, all of the parts in this arrangement are extremely difficult. However, I do feel confident that if an ensemble that is willing to perform Soldier's Tale would definitely be able to pull off this arrangement with a handful of rehearsals. I would like to end by saying that one of the most compelling and impactful features of the original clarinet concerto are the varied colors of Gorb's writing for the orchestra. Due to the fact that there are significantly fewer voices in this arrangement, the individual lines are much more prominent, and this transparency produces a result that sounds much more modern than the original. This arrangement is not meant to replace the original orchestral version, but rather give people a more accessible way to perform the work in the hopes that more orchestras will try to program this. I would like to thank everyone on stage for their help writing these individual parts. I would send them pictures of various little snippets throughout the concerto saying, is this possible? If somebody wrote this for you, you're going to like it. And they were all very helpful with having to write better for their respective instruments. It took a lot of individual practice for them to learn these parts. They're very difficult lines, everybody involved, and I'm very grateful. So thank you guys very much. A special thank you goes to Dr. Barry Ellis, who's the conductor who's conducting this work. He was very helpful in being my ears for the rehearsals, as well as giving me a lot of valuable insight for this arrangement. Special thank you to my committee in Cincinnati, Jonathan Gunn, Ron Offman, and Glenn Price, all of them for taking the time to watch this lecture recital and for their help in every step along for this journey. Another thank you goes to Adam Gorb and Nicholas Cox, who were both very eager and willing to discuss this piece with me throughout the last 2 years. Special thank you to everybody here at UW-Platteville, Ben Finley, and everybody that has helped with this lecture recital today. I am very appreciative. The last thank you goes to my beautiful wife, who's been extremely helpful and understanding throughout this entire process. I'm very grateful for her. She's had to hear this piece and hear me talk about this piece for over a year. So she is probably more happy than anybody else that today is the final performance of this work. We're going to take about 5 minutes to get everything set up, take another tuning note, and then we will hear the performance of my arrangement of Adam Gorb's Clarinet Concerto for Small Chamber Ensemble. Thank you.